At the end of the night, as she clocked out and got her coat from the staff closet, she paused by the dining room door. The lights were dim. The grand piano sat on its platform, lid closed now, a silent, sleeping beast. It looked the same as it always had, but she knew it was different. She had spoken with it, and it had answered Dot. She walked out into the cool night air. The city sounds were a welcome shock after the hothouse atmosphere of the restaurant. In her pocket, the business cards pressed against her leg with every step. She didn't take them out to look. She knew what they were. For the first time in years, she had choices. Real ones. But the most important choice, she realized as she walked towards the bus stop, wasn't about which card to call. It was about who she was now. She was the woman who had played. She was the granddaughter who remembered. She was the waitress who knew how to work hard. All of those things were true. The music hadn't erased her old life. It had simply made it more complicated and more her own. The performance was over. But the real story, she understood, was just beginning. The next week moved in a strange, slow blur. The familiar rhythm of her life, the early bus ride, the tying of the apron, the silent ballet of service was still there, but it felt like she was playing a part. The restaurant itself hummed with a new tension. She was no longer just the quiet waitress with the good memory. She was the pianist. The manager hovered. Every day he found a moment to ask, with a hopeful smile, if she'd thought about his offer. He'd already drafted new menus, he said, with a special note, featuring Friday night piano with our own. And then her name. He said it like it was a gift. She would nod and say she was still thinking, and he would pat her shoulder, his patience wearing thin, but his ambition keeping it in check. The patrons were different, too. Some treated her with a new, exaggerated courtesy, asking for her opinion on the wine or the dessert special, as if she were a visiting dignitary. Others watched her with a keen, curious stare, as if trying to see the magic hidden under her uniform. The loud man from Table 5 requested her section specifically, and spent the whole meal telling his guests about that incredible night, taking on the role of her discoverer. It made her skin crawl. A stack of business cards stayed in her apron pocket. At night, in her small apartment, she would take them out and lay them on her kitchen table. They looked like winning lottery tickets. The Philharmonic, the talent manager, the festival. She typed some of the names into her old laptop. They were all real, all powerful. The woman from the Philharmonic board had a Wikipedia page. The talent manager represented artists she'd actually heard on the radio. One evening, she even dialed the number for the festival director. She listened to it ring twice, her heart hammering, before she quickly hung up. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the feeling of stepping onto a moving train going someplace. She hadn't chosen. What she really wanted was to play the piano again. But not for them. For herself. Late one night after her shift, she didn't go home. She walked to a community college a few blocks from her apartment. She knew they had practice rooms in the basement that were sometimes left unlocked. One was. It was a small, windowless box with an old, scarred upright piano that smelled of dust and old books. It was nothing like the glorious beast at the Gilded Vine. Several keys stuck, and the middle C had a dull, thudding sound. She sat down. And for the first time since that night, she played. Not Gershwin. Not her own composition. Just simple scales, then chords, then fragments of old pieces she'd learned as a child. The sound was tinny and imperfect, but it was honest. In this quiet, ugly room, with no one listening, the music felt like hers again. It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation. She played until her fingers ached, and when she stopped, she knew what she had to do that Friday arrived. The manager had been buzzing with a nervous energy all day. He'd had the piano tuned specially. He'd subtly rearranged some tables to create better sightlines. He was expecting a show. He pulled her aside just before the dinner rush. "All set for tonight?" he asked, his voice brimming with expectation. "I've told some very important people to come. They're excited." She looked at him, this man who saw her as an investment. "I need to talk to you after the shift," she said, her voice calm. His face lit up. "Of course. We can discuss terms in my office. I have a contract drafted. After the shift," she repeated gently, and walked away to greet her first table. The night was busy. She worked her section with her usual quiet efficiency, but she could feel the anticipation building in the room. Whispers followed her. People were definitely looking at the piano, then at her, then back at the piano. The manager had stationed a small, discreet sign on the instrument that read, "Performance at 9 p.m." She hadn't agreed to that dot at 5 minutes to 9. The manager approached her, beaming. "It's time. Ready to shine?" She wiped her hands on a cloth. "I'm going to play one piece," she said. "Just one. Perfect. Leave them wanting more." He winked, missing her meaning entirely. She walked to the platform, this time without the paralyzing fear, but with a deep, solid certainty. The room hushed, quicker than before. This was expected now. They were ready to be amazed again. She saw the same faces, leaning forward, phone subtly held below table level, ready to record dots she sat. She didn't close her eyes. She looked at the keys, then out at the room, meeting the gaze of the eager waiting crowd for just a second. Then she began to play dot. It was a different piece. Something by Bach, a prelude. It was mathematically beautiful, technically flawless, and emotionally contained. She played it perfectly. Every note was clear, every phrase balanced. It was a masterclass in control. And it was cold as ice dot. She played it with none of the raw emotion of the week before. None of the personal story. It was a brilliant, polished shell. When she finished, the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. They were getting what they came for, a spectacle. But the applause lacked the stunned, breathless quality of the first time. This was appreciation for a skill confirmed, not for a soul revealed. She stood, gave the same small bow, and walked off the platform. She did not go to the service station. She walked straight to the manager's office and waited for him. He came in a moment later, flushed with success. Marvelous. Different tone, but they loved it. "Now about that contract." "I'm not signing it," she said quietly. He stopped. "What?" "I'm not going to be the Friday night pianist. I'm leaving the Gilded Vine." His face went through a series of transformations. Confusion, disbelief, anger. "Leaving? But this is your moment. We're building something for you." "You're building something for the restaurant," she corrected him, still quiet. "And I thank you for the opportunity that night. It meant more than you know. But that's not the path for me." He argued. He pleaded. He talked about money, exposure, wasted potential. She listened, but her mind was made up. The cards in her pocket felt heavy. She pulled them out and placed them on his desk, next to the unsigned contract. "I'm going to call some of these people," she said, "but on my own terms. I might play for the Philharmonic's youth program to teach. I might play at the festival, but in a small tent with music I choose. I don't know yet, but it won't be as a surprise act between the main course and dessert." 2 weeks later, she served her last shift. Her coworkers threw her a small party in the kitchen with a cake the chef made that said, "Don't forget us," in wobbly icing. It was the warmest she'd felt there in ages. The elderly gentleman from table 6 left her an envelope with a generous tip and a note that read, "For your music, wherever it takes you." On her final walk through the dining room, She stopped by the piano. She ran a hand along its closed lid. She didn't feel sad. She felt grateful. It had been the key that unlocked a door. She'd been too afraid to open herself. She didn't go to another fancy restaurant. She got a quieter job at a small bookshop cafe that had no piano. She started volunteering at a community center, teaching basic piano to a group of fascinated, fidgety kids. It was chaotic and loud, and nothing was ever perfect. She loved it, and one day she did call the festival director. She explained who she was, and the woman remembered her immediately. "I've been hoping you'd call," she said. Elena proposed something, a short afternoon set in one of the smaller, family-friendly spaces. She wouldn't play Gershwin. She would play a mix of folk melodies, her grandfather's songs, and maybe one simple piece of her own. She would talk a little about where the music came from. The director was quiet for a moment. "It's not what I expected," she said, "but it sounds real. Let's do it." The performance was on a sunny Sunday afternoon. The stage was simple, the piano was decent, and the audience was a mix of families on blankets, old couples in folding chairs, and a few students. She was nervous, but it was a clean nervousness. She played. She told a story about her grandfather. She played her own quiet piece. The applause was warm and unburdened by expectation. Sitting in the audience, unnoticed in the back, was the severe woman with the pearl necklace from the restaurant. She had come out of curiosity. As she listened, she didn't hear a prodigy or a viral sensation. She heard a musician who had found her voice. She smiled, a real, uncalculated smile, and when it was over, she left without introducing herself. Some things, she thought, are better left to grow in their own soil. The air in the Golden Cypress was thick with a quiet kind of noise. It wasn't loud, not like a street or a market. This was the sound of money being comfortable. A low hum of conversations, none too high, none too excited. The clink of a silver fork against fine china. The soft pop of a new wine bottle being opened by a server in a crisp white shirt. The place smelled like leather from the booths, like the clean, sharp scent of lily in huge glass vases. And underneath it all, the rich, warm smell of good food. Roasted meat, something buttery, something with truffle. It was the smell of a lot of money being spent without a second thought. In the middle of the main dining room, at a table that was clearly the best one, sat a man. He was the kind of man who leaned back in his chair like he owned the air around it. His suit was dark and smooth, no wrinkles, and it probably cost more than some people's cars. His watch was a heavy, silent thing on his wrist, catching the low light. His name was Leo. He wasn't just having dinner. He was holding court. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing, and his smile was a quick flash he used when he made a point. With him were 3 other people. 2 men and a woman, all dressed just as carefully. They were potential investors. This dinner wasn't for fun. It was a move in a very long, expensive game. Leo was telling a story, his hands drawing shapes in the air. "So I looked him right in the eye," Leo said, his voice confident and smooth, "and I said, 'Your sentiment is charming, but it doesn't pay the quarterly dividend.' And that was that. We had the company by the end of the week. The others laughed, a dry, knowing sound. They sipped their wine, a deep red that looked almost black in the glass. A few feet away, moving like a shadow between the pools of golden light from the small table lamps, was a young woman. Her name was Elena. She wore the uniform of the restaurant, a simple black dress, flat black shoes, a small white apron tied neatly at her waist. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight, practical bun. In this room of bright silks and loud ties, she was meant to be invisible. Part of the scenery, like the paintings on the wall or the heavy velvet curtains. She was a waitress. Her job was to see everything and be seen by no one, to watch the water glasses, to clear the plates at the exact right moment without interrupting a sentence, to be a ghost who made sure the living had everything they needed. Right now, her eyes were on Leo's table, more specifically, on Leo's hand. As he made another grand gesture, his arm swept wide, his fingers almost brushing against his tall, thin wine glass. The glass wobbled. Just a tiny shake. The red wine sloshed up one side, nearly kissing the rim. The people at the table didn't notice. They were caught in Leo's story. But Elena saw it. She moved forward, not hurried, but with a quiet purpose. She didn't say, "Excuse me?" She didn't interrupt. She simply appeared at the edge of the table as Leo paused to take a breath. Her hand, quick and steady, reached out. She didn't grab the glass. She simply placed 2 fingers lightly against its side, straightening it, stopping the wobble. Then, with her other hand, she picked up the empty bread basket from the center of the table. Leo's eyes flicked down to her for half a second. He didn't stop talking. He didn't thank her. His glance was the kind you give to a piece of furniture that had moved slightly on its own. A minor correction in his world. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, not to her, but to the now stable glass, and continued with his story. The real value wasn't in the assets, you see. It was in the silence of the competition afterwards. Elena faded back, the empty basket in her hand. As she turned toward the swinging doors that led to the kitchen, her gaze swept the room once more. It was a habit. Check the tables. Check the guests' faces. See who needs something before they know they need it. This time, her eyes didn't stop on the people. They drifted to the far corner of the room, near a large, dark window that reflected the chandeliers. There, sitting alone on a small raised platform, was a grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, its black wood polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the soft glow of a single small spotlight above it. The keyboard was closed. The stool was pushed in neatly. It looked more like a sculpture than something meant to be played. A silent, elegant monument to good taste. For a moment, just a brief second, Alana's blank, professional expression changed. Something flickered in her eyes. It wasn't longing exactly. It was more like recognition. A tiny, private smile touched the very corner of her mouth and was gone, so fast you would have missed it if you weren't staring right at her. Her fingers, holding the wicker basket, flexed slightly, as if they were pressing down on something only she could feel. Then the moment passed. The kitchen doors swung open with a soft whoosh of hot air and the clatter of pans. The head chef's voice, sharp and fast, called out an order. The spell was broken. Alana's face smoothed back into its calm, attentive mask. She stepped through the doors, back into the bright, noisy, chaotic world of the kitchen, leaving the quiet, perfumed opulence of the dining room behind. Inside the kitchen, it was a different universe. The heat was a physical thing. Steam rose from giant pots. Sizzling sounds came from every direction. The air smelled of garlic, searing steak, and fresh herbs. A line cook shouted, 2 halibut, 1 beef, mid-rare, fire now. Another server rushed past Elena, a tray of appetizers balanced high on one hand. Elena went to a side counter and placed the empty bread basket in a stack of others. She didn't stop. She picked up a heavy silver tray that had 3 small porcelain bowls on it. Creme brulee, their sugar tops caramelized to a perfect glassy brown. She balanced the tray on her palm and forearm, the way she had been trained Dot as she waited for a moment by the pass, where the chef placed finished plates. The head waiter, a stern man with a graying mustache, approached her. Table 9 needs more sparkling water. And check on Table 5's wine. The gentleman in the blue tie looks nearly empty. Yes, sir, Elena said, her voice quiet but clear. The headwaiter looked at her for a second longer. You're doing good work tonight. That main table? Important people. Stay sharp. Elena just nodded. She wasn't one for many words during her shift. She saved her energy for moving, for watching, for being in the right place at the right time. She pushed back through the swinging doors, the tray of desserts steady as a rock, and re-entered the golden world of the dining room. She delivered the cream, Broly, to a table of 4 older women celebrating a birthday. They cooed over the desserts, their laughter light and tinkling like bells. Elena smiled a small, polite smile. Enjoy, she said softly, as she walked back toward Leo's table to check the water and wine. She couldn't help but let her eyes slide once more to the piano in the corner. It sat there, silent and grand. In her mind, for the briefest flash, she didn't see the black lacquer. She saw the smooth ivory of the keys, felt their cool touch under her fingers. She heard not the clink of cutlery, but the deep, resonant sound of a low C, the bright ring of a high G. But that was a thought for another time. Another life. Right now, the man in the sharp suit at table 7 was signaling for the check. The woman at table 3 had dropped her napkin. And Leo's laugh, loud and confident, boomed out again as he finished another story. The piano would have to wait. It always had to wait. Elena took a quiet breath, smoothed her apron, and got back to work. The rich chocolate torte had been eaten, the last crumbs swept away by small silver forks. The conversation at Leo's table had settled into a comfortable, deep hum. The business talk had shifted from sharp details to broader visions, the future of markets, of industries. It was the part of the evening where deals were softened by good wine, and the feeling of shared understanding got the older gentleman. The one Leo was most keen to impress set his espresso cup down carefully on its saucer. He had a kind face, lined with age, but his eyes were bright and watchful. He leaned back and let his gaze drift around the room, taking in the glittering chandeliers, the deep red walls, the well-dressed people. He sighed, a sound of pure contentment. You know, he said, his voice a gentle rumble that cut through the other chatter at the table. This place truly has everything. Impeccable service. Food that is an event all by itself. He gestured with one hand. Even the art on the walls is real. I checked. He smiled. But it is missing one thing. A final touch. Leo, always eager to provide, to be the man who could fulfill any wish, leaned forward. Name it. Anything. The chef's private reserve? A cigar from the humidor? The old man shook his head slowly. His eyes had landed on the far corner. That, he said, pointing with his chin. That beautiful instrument. A piano like that isn't just furniture. It has a soul. It deserves to sing. It's a shame to let it sit there all night like a museum piece. Music. Music is what turns a meal into a memory. A small, agreeing murmur came from the others at the table. The woman nodded. He's right. A little atmosphere would be perfect. This was Leo's moment. A simple request he could turn into a display of his influence. He didn't just wave at a server. He raised his hand, fingers poised, and gave a single, sharp snap. The sound cut through the low din of the restaurant. It was a sound that demanded immediate attention, like a king summoning a servant. Elena was at a side station, refilling a water pitcher from a large chrome dispenser. The snap made her shoulders tense for a fraction of a second, a tiny movement no one saw. She finished her task, set the pitcher down calmly, and turned. She recognized the signal. It came from the main table, from the man in the expensive suit. She walked over, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her face a polite, blank page. Yes, sir? How may I assist you? Her voice was low and clear, meant to be heard only at the table, Leo didn't look at her directly at first. He was still looking at his important guest, a showman playing to his audience. "The piano," he said, as if giving a grand order. "Tell the manager to send out the pianist. Our friend here would like some music. Something classic. Let's bring this room to life." Elena stood very still for a moment. Then she gave a small, apologetic dip of her head. "I am sorry to say, sir, the pianist scheduled for this evening called in ill a few hours ago. There is no replacement available tonight." The news created a tiny bubble of disappointment at the table. The old man's face fell just a little. Leo's smile tightened. This was a minor flaw in his perfect evening, a scratch on the polished surface. He didn't like flaws. His eyes finally swung to Elena, really looking at her for the first time since she'd saved his wineglass. She was just the waitress, the messenger of bad news. A thought occurred to him, a way to salvage the moment, to turn the disappointment into a bit of amusement for his guests. A playful jab, a joke at the expense of the help. He let his gaze travel from her sensible shoes up to her neat bun, a slow, almost theatrical inspection. A smirk began to play on his lips. "Well," he said, his voice taking on a light, teasing tone that his table recognized. They leaned in, sensing the shift. "That is a pity. But you?" He gestured toward her. "You seem to know your way around the floor so well. Quick on your feet. Surely in all your duties. You've picked up a tune or two?" He raised an eyebrow, his smirk growing. "Or do they only hire for carrying plates and delivering messages?" A soft chuckle rippled around his table. The other investors smiled, watching the young waitress, waiting for her to fluster, to stammer an excuse, to lower her eyes. It was a small, harmless bit of fun. A distraction. Elena's expression did not change. She didn't look embarrassed or angry. She didn't shrink back. She simply listened, her dark eyes meeting Leo's with a stillness that was unnerving. The chuckles died down. The silence at the table stretched for a beat too long, made awkward by her lack of reaction, that Leo felt a flicker of irritation. His joke hadn't landed. She wasn't playing her part. "Well?" he prompted, his voice losing some of its playful edge. "Can you manage a little something? Chopsticks? 3 blind mice? Or is that beyond the job description?" He expected her to break then, to mumble an apology and flee. Instead, she did something unexpected. Her eyes left his and moved across the room, toward the dark, silent piano in the corner. It was a long look, as if she was measuring the distance, checking the light on the stool, seeing something no one else could see. When she looked back at him, there was something different in her face. Not defiance, not anger. It was a kind of quiet resolve, like someone who has just made a simple, firm decision. Her voice, when she spoke, was still soft, but it carried a new weight. It was no longer just the voice of a server. "If it will satisfy the request," she said, each word clear and deliberate, "I will play." The statement was so simple, so blunt, it left no room for the teasing tone of before. Leo was caught off guard. He blinked. He had expected a no. He had not expected this calm, direct yes. It took the wind out of his sails. All he could do was make a vague, flapping gesture with his hand toward the piano. "By all means," he said, his voice suddenly lacking its earlier confidence. "The stage is yours." Elena gave one more small, formal nod, not to him, but to the table as a whole. Then she turned. She didn't walk quickly. She didn't walk slowly. She just walked, her flat shoes making no sound on the thick carpet, moving through the pools of golden light, past the other diners who were starting to notice something happening. Leo watched her go, a strange feeling in his gut. The joke was over, but it didn't feel funny anymore. It felt like he had pushed a button and had no idea what machine he had just started. He cleared his throat and forced a laugh, turning back to his guests. Well, this should be interesting. He picked up his wine glass, mostly to have something to do with his hands. The old gentleman was watching Elena's retreating back, a curious, thoughtful look on his face. He wasn't smiling the amused smile of the others. He looked intrigued at the other tables. Whispers started. A few people pointed subtly with their eyes. Asterisk, is the waitress going to play? The general manager, standing by the Mater D stand, frowned deeply. He took a half-step forward, but then stopped. The main table had requested it. He couldn't interfere, no. He crossed his arms, his face tight with worry, while he reached the small platform. She stepped up onto it. She didn't look at the audience she was about to have. She looked only at the piano. It was like she was greeting an old friend. She reached out and pulled the stool out from under the keyboard. It was a heavy, padded stool. She adjusted its height with a few firm turns of the knob underneath, a practiced motion. She sat down. The spotlight above the piano, which had been dim, seemed to grow a little brighter, as if sensing its moment. It shone down on her black uniform, on her hands, as she let them rest in her lap for a moment. The entire restaurant had grown quieter. The clinking of cutlery had slowed. People were watching. Leo took a large sip of his wine, his eyes fixed on the scene across the room. The waitress on the piano bench looked small against the huge, black shape of the grand piano. This was going to be a disaster, he thought. A clumsy, embarrassing little tune. He would have to laugh it off, make another joke to save the evening. He braced himself for the first wrong note, but Elena just sat there, perfectly still. She wasn't nervous. She was gathering herself. She lifted her hands and placed them gently on the closed fallboard, the lid that covered the keys. Then, with both hands, she smoothly opened it, revealing the neat row of black and white keys. They gleamed under the light. She let her hands hover just above them, her fingers curved naturally. She took one last deep breath that lifted her shoulders slightly. And then she began. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, there was only silence. The young woman sat before the vast expanse of black and white keys, her hands suspended in the air. The spotlight made her uniform look almost blue, and her face was a pale, calm mask in the shadows. Every person in the restaurant was looking at her. Some were curious. Some, like the worried manager, were bracing for an embarrassing disaster. Leo, at his table, held his wine glass halfway to his lips, a fixed, expectant smirk on his face. He was waiting for the plinking, clumsy notes of a child's song. The first sound was not a note. It was a deep, resonant thrum, like the lowest string of a cello being plucked in a cavern. It was a single chord, but it was so full, so heavy with feeling, that it seemed to suck all the other sounds out of the room. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. It vibrated in the water glasses. It felt like it came up through the floor. Leo's smirk vanished. His hand slowly lowered the glass back to the table without a sound. The chord hung in the air, decaying slowly, and then her hands moved. They didn't creep or tiptoe across the keys. They flew. They fell like rain and then rose like a storm. The music that erupted was not chopsticks. It was not a simple tune. It was a powerful, roiling ocean of sound. It was dark and beautiful, and full of a terrible, aching sadness. The melody was a mournful ghost that wound its way through crashing waves of bass notes. One moment it was a delicate, tragic whisper, the next a thunderous, powerful declaration of despair. It was Rachmaninoff, his prelude in C-sharp minor, a piece that is a mountain to climb for even seasoned pianists. Not because it is always fast, but because it demands every ounce of feeling, every shred of technical control a person possesses. The change in the room was immediate and total. At Leo's table, the investor with the kind face, the one who had asked for music, closed his eyes. His head tilted back slightly. This was not what he had expected, but it was infinitely more. He wasn't hearing background music. He was being told a story without words, a story of loss and struggle and immense, powerful beauty. A faint, genuine smile touched his lips. The woman next to Leo let out a small, unconscious breath, a sigh that got lost in the swell of the music. She stopped looking at the waitress and stared down at the tablecloth, her eyes wide, listening with her whole body. Leo himself felt something strange happen in his chest. It was a tight, cold feeling. The confidence that had filled him all night, the sense that he was the center of this expensive world, began to leak away, replaced by a dawning, unbelievable understanding. This was not a joke. This was not an embarrassment. This was mastery. He watched her, really watched her. The efficient, invisible waitress was gone. In her place was someone else entirely. Her back was straight, but not stiff. It moved with the music, a slight sway as she leaned into the passionate phrases. Her head was bent, her gaze locked on her flying hands, but she wasn't reading music. She was feeling it. Every crashing chord came from her shoulders, flowing down her arms and into her fingers. Every tender, singing note was shaped by the subtle turn of her wrists. Her face was transformed. The blank, polite mask was gone. In the soft light, he could see her brow was slightly furrowed in concentration, but also in something deeper. Her lips were parted just a little. There was a faint sheen of sweat on her temple. This was not a performance for them. This was something she was living, something she was pulling from a place deep inside herself and pouring into the piano. The sound filled the golden cypress, but it did something more than that. It changed the very air. The crystal chandeliers didn't just sparkle. They seemed to tremble. The rich smells of food were forgotten. The opulent gold leaf on the walls, the expensive paintings, the luxurious velvet, it all started to look like what it was. Just stuff. Decoration. The only real, true thing in the room was the sound coming from that piano, and the young woman making it. A busboy had frozen in the doorway to the kitchen, a tray of dirty dishes in his hands. He just stood there, mouth open, listening. The head chef had come out from the hot kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. He leaned against the doorframe, his stern face softened by surprise. The worried manager had uncrossed his arms. His expression was now one of pure shock. At the other tables, people had stopped eating entirely. Forks rested on half-finished plates. Conversations were a forgotten thing. A couple holding hands across their table tightened their grip, their eyes meeting over the flickering candle, sharing the emotion the music stirred in them. An older man dining alone had turned his chair completely around to face the piano, his napkin still tucked into his shirt, tears glistening in his eyes. The music built and built. It was a storm rolling in over a dark sea. The low notes rumbled like distant thunder. The high, sharp notes were like lightning flashing. Elena's hands were a blur, crossing over each other, leaping from the deep bass to the shining treble. The physical power it took was visible. This was not delicate fingerwork. This was athletic, passionate, full-bodied playing. A lock of dark hair had escaped her tight bun and fell against her cheek. She didn't brush it away. Leo felt utterly small. The story he had been telling earlier about buying a company felt cheap and hollow in his mind, like the chatter of a child. His expensive watch felt heavy and stupid on his wrist. What was it for? To measure the minutes until the next deal? This music was beyond time. His sharp suit was just a costume. She, in her simple black dress, was the real person. She had a soul that could speak this language of angels and storms. And he just had a bank account. He had snapped his fingers at her. He had made a joke of her. The memory of his own voice saying, "Or do they only hire for carrying plates?" echoed in his head, ugly and shrill against the beautiful tragedy of the music. A hot wave of shame washed over him, so strong it made his face feel warm. He wanted to look away from her, but he couldn't. He was trapped. They all were. The piece moved into its final, furious section. The tempo increased. The chords became more dissonant, more desperate. It was a frantic, powerful struggle. Elena's whole body was involved now, leaning forward, then pulling back, her feet working the pedals unseen below. The sound was almost overwhelming, a magnificent, controlled chaos. And then, with three final, thunderous, and perfectly spaced chords, boom, 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 it ended. The last note hung in the air, vibrating deep in the wood of the piano, in the bones of the listeners. Then, silence. A total, profound, and breathtaking silence. It was thicker and heavier than the silence before she had played. No one moved. No one breathed. The spell was still complete. On the platform, Elena's shoulders slumped, just a little. The immense energy that had been flowing out of her seemed to retreat. She lifted her hands from the keys and placed them gently back in her lap. She sat very still for a few seconds, her head bowed, as if saying a silent goodbye to the instrument, or maybe to the piece of herself she had just given away. Then she slowly stood up. She did not smile. She did not bow deeply like a concert pianist. She simply turned toward the room. Her eyes, which had been so full of fiery life moments before, were calm again, but also distant, as if she was returning from a very long journey. She gave a single slight and humble nod of her head. It wasn't directed at Leo's table. It wasn't for any one person. It was an acknowledgement to the room, to the piano, to the music itself. And without a single word, she stepped off the platform and began to walk. Not back to Leo's table. Not to take a bow. She walked calmly, steadily, back toward the swinging doors of the kitchen, the same doors she had come from 1,000 times that night. The spotlight was left shining on an empty stool, and a piano that seemed to glow, still humming with the ghost of the song. The silence didn't last. But what broke it wasn't the usual restaurant noise. It wasn't the clatter of plates or the restart of conversations. It was a single pair of hands, clapping. Slow, solid, heartfelt claps. It was the old gentleman at Leo's table. He had opened his eyes, and they were bright with emotion. He was looking at the empty piano, but he was seeing the young woman who had just left. He clapped with a kind of reverence, not excitement. Then, as if his clap was a signal, the whole room erupted. It wasn't wild, cheering applause. It was deeper than that. It was the sound of people who had been holding their breath, finally letting go. It was thunderous, respectful, and real. People pushed their chairs back to stand. They weren't just applauding a performance. They were thanking her for the beauty, for the shock, for making them feel something real in a place designed for artifice. The sound of it washed over Leo like a wave. He was still sitting, frozen in his chair. The applause felt like it was happening to someone else, in some other room. He was trapped in the bubble of his own thoughts, which were loud and ugly and full of shame. The clapping hands around him seemed to be accusing him. Asterisk, you snapped your fingers at her. You joked about her. Asterisk. He looked down at his own hands. They were lying flat on the white tablecloth. He hadn't joined the applause. He couldn't make them move. He felt like if he clapped, it would be the most fake thing he had ever done. He just stared at his fancy watch, its tiny gears measuring seconds that now felt meaningless. The applause began to die down. People settled back into their seats, but the room was transformed. The air felt charged clean. The low conversations that started up again were different. They were hushed, amazed. People leaned toward each other, speaking in soft, wondering tones. Who was that? That was unbelievable. I've paid hundreds for concert tickets that weren't half as good. At Leo's table, the mood was broken, and everyone knew it. The old gentleman finally stopped clapping and turned his warm, knowing eyes to Leo. "Well?" he said, his voice full of a gentle awe. That was a gift. A genuine, unexpected gift. "You have quite a staff here, Leo." The words were kind, but they cut like a knife. You have quite a staff, as if Leo had anything to do with it. As if he had planned this wonderful surprise. Leo tried to smile, to reclaim the evening. It was a stiff, painful movement of his lips. "Yes," he managed to say, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Quite something." He reached for his wine glass, desperate for something to do. He took a gulp. The expensive wine tasted like nothing. Like flavored water. The woman next to him was still buzzing. I've never heard anything like it in a restaurant. Never. She was a ghost, just serving us, and then a virtuoso. It's like a movie. Her enthusiasm was genuine, but it only made Leo feel worse. He had been the villain in that movie. The smug man who set the amazing twist in motion by being a jerk. He tried to steer the conversation back. "So, as I was saying, about the liquidity of it, but where did she learn?" The old gentleman interrupted, not meanly, but with a curiosity that was far more interesting than liquidity. "That piece. That's years of study. Decades, even. To play with that kind of feeling. That doesn't come from a few lessons." He looked toward the kitchen doors, as if he could see through them. "There's a story there. A real human story." Leo fell silent. He had no answer. He knew nothing about her. She was the waitress. A function. A pair of hands to bring food and take plates. The idea that she had a life, a history, a towering talent that she brought to this job and hid every night. It was a thought that made his head spin. He felt stupid. A profound, deep-down stupidity that had nothing to do with business or money. The manager, seeing the applause end, had sprung into action. He was at the table of the celebrating women, apologizing smoothly if the music had disturbed them. They laughed, waving him away. Disturbed? It was the highlight of our night. One of them said. Then the manager approached Leo's table. His professional smile was back, but his eyes were still wide with the aftermath of shock. "My sincerest apologies, Mr. Vance, for the unconventional interlude. Is there anything I can get for you all? Perhaps a complimentary digestive? Something to settle the atmosphere?" Leo just shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. The old gentleman answered for him. "No, thank you. The music was more than enough. Please, just the check when you're ready." As the manager nodded and retreated, Leo finally found his voice. It was hoarse. "The check. Yes, I'll take care of it." It was the last card he had to play. The thing he could still do. Pay. He could buy this incredibly expensive meal and try to pretend it made him the host of this evening, the provider of this experience. But everyone at the table knew the truth. He hadn't provided the most valuable part. He had accidentally uncovered it, and in the worst possible way. When the heavy leather folder was placed silently beside his elbow, Leo opened it without even looking at the total. He pulled a sleek, black credit card from his wallet and placed it inside. The gesture felt empty, a ritual with no meaning. While they waited for the card to be processed, the conversation at the table tried to restart, but it was limp. It kept circling back to the music, to her. No one wanted to talk about mergers anymore. The deals, the projections, the clever strategies, it all seemed so thin, so bloodless, compared to the raw, powerful humanity they had just witnessed. Leo kept glancing at the kitchen doors. Part of him hoped she would come back out. He didn't know what he would say. Sorry seemed too small, and also impossible to say in front of everyone. That was amazing, felt insulting, coming from him. He just wanted to see her again, to see if the waitress was back, or if the ghost of the pianist still lingered in her eyes. But the door stayed shut. She did not reappear. The server returned with his card and the receipt to sign. Leo scribbled his name and added a tip that was far, far larger than usual. A guilty tip. A tip that tried to say, "I'm sorry I treated you like furniture," and "Thank you for showing me I'm a fool," all in one silent financial gesture. He knew it was pathetic. As they stood to leave, Leo felt unsteady. The opulent room seemed to press in on him. The gold was garish. The crystal was brittle. The rich people talking softly at their tables seemed like actors in a play he no longer wanted to be in. Walking out, they passed the piano. It was just a piece of furniture again, silent and polished. But Leo couldn't look at it without hearing the echoes of those final crashing chords. He felt the old gentleman's hand on his shoulder for a moment. "A night to remember, Leo," he said quietly. Truly. They said their goodbyes outside under the cool night sky. The promises to follow up on the deal were made, but they lacked their earlier conviction. The handshakes were firm, but the connection felt broken. The old gentleman got into his car, still with that thoughtful, moved look on his face. Leo stood alone on the sidewalk after the others had driven away. The valet brought his own expensive, silent car around. He got in, but he didn't start the engine right away. He just sat in the dark, leather-scented interior. In his mind, he wasn't in the car. He was back at the table, watching her walk toward the piano. He heard his own smug voice making the joke. He saw her calm, resolved face. Then he heard the music again. That first, devastating chord. It played on a loop in his head, drowning out every other thought. He had come to the Golden Cypress to close a deal, to show his power, to be the king of his small, rich world. He was leaving with the deafening understanding that the most powerful person in the room had been the one he considered beneath his notice. And she hadn't needed a single word to dethrone him. She had just needed 3 minutes at a piano. The kitchen was a different kind of storm. The heat hit her first, a wall of steam and sizzling oil after the cool, perfumed air of the dining room. The noise was a clattering, shouting chaos, the slam of a grill, the hiss of a spray nozzle, the head chef's voice barking orders. For a moment, she just stood inside the swinging doors, letting the familiar chaos wrap around her. Her hands, which had just been flying across the piano keys, hung still at her sides. They trembled, just a little. Not from nerves, but from the aftershock of the music, the release of something held tightly inside for a very long time. The other kitchen staff stopped what they were doing. The busboy with the frozen tray was still there, his eyes wide. A line cook, a spatula in hand, gave a slow, deliberate nod. No one clapped here. This wasn't that kind of place. But the silence they gave her, a break in the kitchen's relentless noise, was its own kind of applause. The head chef wiped his hands on a towel and walked over. His stern face was unreadable. He looked her up and down. "Well," he grunted. "That happened." He paused, then his expression softened, just a fraction. The table loved it. The whole room did. He shook his head, almost to himself. "I didn't know you could do that." She just nodded, not knowing what to say. "Thank you didn't feel right." "All right," the chef said, his business voice returning. "Break's over. Table 12 salads are dying in the window. Let's move." And just like that, she was back. The pianist was gone. Elena, the waitress, returned. She took a deep breath, tied her apron a little tighter, and went to the stainless steel counter to pick up the waiting salads. Her world narrowed back down to the weight of a tray, the timing of courses, the level of water in a glass. But something had changed. As she moved through the dining room again, the eyes that followed her were different. Before, they looked through her. Now they saw her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. A man at a corner table caught her eye as she passed and smiled, a real, warm smile of appreciation. She gave a small, quick nod and kept walking, her professional mask firmly back in place. Back in the kitchen, during a rare lull, the young dishwasher, a guy with kind eyes, sidled up to her at the sink where she was refilling water pitchers. "That was insane," he whispered, a grin spreading across his face. "You made the big guy at table 7 look like a peeled shrimp." It was beautiful. She allowed herself a small, tired smile back. "It was just a piece," she whispered. "It wasn't just anything," he said. Then he went back to his steaming sink. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine. She cleared the final desserts from Leo's table after they left, her eyes avoiding the spot where he had sat. The crumb-laden plates and empty coffee cups were just another mess to clean. She didn't think about him. She thought about the feel of the keys, the way the sound had filled the room, and for a few minutes filled her. It was a feeling she stored away carefully, like a precious stone to be taken out and examined later, in private. Finally, the last guest was gone. The lights were turned up bright, chasing away the intimate golden glow. The clatter now was the sound of cleaning, chairs being stacked on tables, vacuums roaring, the clink of glasses being sorted out in the back by the lockers. She changed out of her uniform and into her own clothes, simple jeans, a worn sweater, a comfortable pair of sneakers. She pulled her hair out of the tight bun, letting it fall around her shoulders with a relieved sigh. She looked like a different person again. A student, maybe. Just a young woman tired after a long day's work. She said quiet goodbyes to the night cleaner and the closing manager. As she pushed open the heavy back door, the cold night air was a shock. It was clean and sharp, smelling of the city and distant rain. The alley behind the golden cypress was dark, lit by a single buzzing fluorescent light over the door. She walked to the bus stop, her bag slung over her shoulder. The city at this hour was quieter. The roar of the day had faded to a rumble. She could still feel the vibration of the piano in her bones, a pleasant, fading hum. When she got to her small apartment, it was dark and quiet. She dropped her bag by the door and went straight to the corner of the main room. There, covered by a simple cloth, was an electronic keyboard. It wasn't a grand piano. It was small, with slightly stiff keys, and you had to use headphones to play it so you wouldn't bother the neighbors. She pulled the cloth off. She sat down, put on the headphones, and turned it on. For a long time, she just sat there in the silent apartment, her fingers resting on the plastic keys. She didn't play the Rachmaninoff. That piece lived in a grand piano, in a moment of defiance and release. Here, in the quiet dark, she played something else. Something soft and gentle and flowing. A Chopin nocturne. It was like a lullaby for herself. The music from the headphones filled only her own ears, a private world of sound. This was why she played. Not for the applause, not to shock men in expensive suits. For this, for the peace it brought to her own soul. For the connection to something bigger than a long shift or a rude customer dot. She played until the tiredness seeped into her fingers. Then she stopped, covered the keyboard again, and got ready for bed. As she lay in the dark, the memory of the restaurant played in her mind. Not the music, but the moment after. the silence, then the wave of sound from the people. It had felt good. It had felt real. But tomorrow was another day. Another